When Representative Jasmine Crockett made her now infamous comment during a televised panel, few expected it to stir the kind of nationwide conversation it did. What began as a routine discussion around political ethics and double standards quickly took a personal turn when Crockett subtly but unmistakably invoked Melania Trump's name not to insult, not to mock, but to raise a question that had long lingered under the surface of public discourse. Her words were measured, almost casual, but they carried weight. "We've got a former First Lady who disappeared from public view for months, while her husband was busy being indicted not once, not twice, but 4 times. Asterisk, it wasn't just what she said it was how she said it." Crockett didn't yell. She didn't personalize her critique beyond the political implications. Yet her question hit a nerve in the American psyche. For years, Donald Trump had crafted a public persona that hinged not only on power and wealth, but also on projecting the image of a strong, unified family. Melania, although often quiet, had played her role in that image. She stood beside him at major events, smiled when expected, and spoke when necessary. But as Trump's legal battles intensified with indictments in New York, Georgia, Florida, and Washington, her absence from both media and public life grew glaring. Asterisk Crockett's observation brought that absence back into the spotlight. It wasn't a sensational accusation, it was a question wrapped in concern, couched in political critique. And yet, it was enough to send shockwaves through social media, press rooms, and even Mar-a-Lago itself. Overnight, the question "where is Melania?" went from whispered speculation to front-page headlines. Some commentators viewed the question as irrelevant, arguing that spouses should not be required to defend the legal issues of their partners. Others countered that when a political figure makes family values a cornerstone of their message, scrutiny over their own family's unity becomes fair game. Asterisk Donald Trump, never one to remain silent when publicly challenged, was reportedly incensed, according to close aides and journalists with knowledge of the situation. Trump spent hours venting about the comment behind closed doors, calling it disgraceful and accusing Crockett of crossing a line. What seemed to bother him most wasn't just that Crockett had mentioned Melania in it, was that the public listened. The comment had struck a chord. It challenged the illusion of solidarity and control that Trump tried so carefully to curate. Asterisk, this wasn't the first time Trump had dealt with uncomfortable questions about Melania's visibility. But in the past, they had mostly come from tabloids or entertainment shows. Now, it was being asked on the congressional record by a sitting member of the House that elevated the issue from gossip to political substance. It made Trump look vulnerable not because his wife was absent, but because someone had finally put words to a perception many had silently harbored that something was off. Asterisk, the media quickly picked up the thread. Segments aired comparing Melania's visibility during Trump's presidency to her near-total silence during his post-presidency legal battles. Analysts revisited her brief statements from the past moments when she did publicly defend Trump, even if reluctantly. Those clips placed beside her long public silence in 2023 and 2024 painted a new picture, one that was more complicated, more opaque, and undeniably more intriguing. Asterisk, meanwhile, Crockett didn't issue clarifications or walk her statement back. Instead, in a later interview, she simply expanded on her point. "This isn't about being personal," she said. "It's about consistency. If we're going to talk about morals and traditional families, then the public deserves to see what that actually looks like when the pressure's on." Asterisk, her approach resonated with many, especially younger viewers and politically engaged women who felt that double standards were constantly at play. If a female politician's husband disappeared during a scandal, they argued the questions would be immediate and relentless. So why shouldn't the same standard apply to Donald Trump and Melania? Asterisk, Trump's political machine was quick to respond, with allies rushing to his defense on talk shows and conservative media outlets. But even their responses revealed something interesting. They weren't denying Melania's absence. They were simply trying to explain it away. She was private, focused on family, avoiding the circus. Yet those explanations didn't quiet the curiosity. Instead, they fueled more speculation. Asterisk, the real power of Crockett's statement wasn't in the words alone, it was in the spotlight. It turned on an unspoken question. In a single moment, she managed to reframe a long-ignored silence into a public conversation. And for Donald Trump, who thrives on controlling the narrative, that unexpected pivot was more disruptive than any headline or headline grabber could have predicted. The reaction from Donald Trump to Jasmine Crockett's comment was anything but muted. While the words spoken on that panel might have been calm and calculated, they had the effect of igniting a fire behind the scenes. According to multiple individuals familiar with the former president's inner circle, Trump's anger was immediate and intensely personal. It wasn't just another Democrat taking a jab at him. It was someone putting his wife's absence into the national spotlight, and doing so in a way that he couldn't easily dismiss. Trump had built much of his identity around image control. From the towering gold letters of Trump Tower to the carefully curated moments at campaign rallies, he had always understood the value of optics. His family had been part of that brand from day one. His children featured prominently in both his business and political ventures, and Melania had been positioned as the poised, elegant First Lady with a mysterious aura. That aura, however, had slowly transformed into a question mark, and Crockett, whether intentionally or not, had dared to say what others wouldn't. Melania's silence in the face of her husband's legal turmoil was deafening. Sources close to the situation said Trump was watching coverage of the congressional hearing when Crockett made her remarks. Almost immediately, staffers noted a shift in his demeanor. What followed was reportedly a long, frustrated tirade about how disrespectful it was for members of Congress to involve his wife in political attacks. He dismissed Crockett as classless and desperate, but it was clear her comments had landed harder than he was willing to admit publicly. What stung wasn't just the mention of Melania in it, was the virality of it. The fact that the story began to trend online before he or his team could control the narrative. The response from Trump's inner circle was swift. Some advisors tried to spin the situation, suggesting that Melania's silence was a sign of strength and dignity. Others tried to shift the focus back onto Crockett, painting her as using cheap personal attacks to gain attention. But the one person whose voice was noticeably absent again was Melania herself. As the media cycle churned and questions about her grew louder, there was still no statement, no appearance, and no response from her end. For Trump, that only added to the frustration. He was used to having surrogates and allies speak up when a controversy exploded. But when the controversy was about Melania's lack of visibility, it became a problem that couldn't be deflected so easily. Even friendly outlets, typically loyal to Trump, began cautiously addressing the issue. The tone was more defensive than inquisitive. But it showed that the comment had crossed political lines and entered mainstream consciousness. Behind closed doors, Trump's anger reportedly morphed into something closer to paranoia. He demanded updates on how the story was performing online, checking social media trends, and asking aides whether the media was still running segments about it. At one point, an advisor reportedly suggested releasing an old photo of him and Melania at a private event to stem the speculation. Trump rejected the idea, allegedly saying it would make it seem like they were on the ropes. This overreaction revealed something deeper for a man who prided himself on controlling his image. The idea that someone like Crockett could puncture that illusion with a single calm sentence was infuriating. Trump's political career had weathered investigations, impeachments, and media scrutiny. But personal matters, especially involving his family, often drew the strongest reactions from him. It was as if those matters, unlike political attacks, touched a vulnerability he didn't like to acknowledge. As the days passed, Trump began incorporating the controversy into his stump speeches, though carefully. He didn't mention Crockett by name, but he referred to Democrats who don't know how to behave and warned that they'll go after your family if they can't beat you on policy. The crowd, largely sympathetic, cheered, but outside his base, the controversy lingered, and so did the questions. Melania's continued silence only reinforced Crockett's original point, and Trump's angry reaction became part of the story. Even more telling was how Trump's frustration wasn't rooted in policy, legality, or ethics. It was in narrative control. Crockett had struck at the heart of the Trump mythos, the image of the successful, composed, and untouchable family unit. By asking a single pointed question, she had destabilized that image and forced Trump into an emotional, visible response. And in the world of politics, especially for someone as image-conscious as Donald Trump, that kind of disruption wasn't just an annoyance. It was a threat. What made Jasmine Crockett's statement so impactful wasn't just the content it was the delivery. In an environment where fiery rhetoric and explosive sound bites often dominate, she chose a calm, deliberate tone that contrasted sharply with the storm it stirred. Rather than engaging in personal attacks or resorting to hyperbole, she asked a question that was both reasonable and piercing. Why has Melania Trump been so absent during Donald Trump's numerous legal challenges? It wasn't said with malice or mockery. It was said with a measured curiosity that made it impossible to ignore. Asterisk. The choice of tone gave Crockett's words a kind of gravity that louder voices often fail to achieve. In avoiding theatrics, she left no room for easy dismissal. It's easy to paint a shouting critic as emotional or irrational, but Crockett didn't give anyone that opportunity. She didn't demand outrage, she invited reflection. And that's precisely why her comment had staying power. People didn't just hear what she said, they thought about it afterward. In a political landscape dominated by noise, her clarity cut through. Asterisk for Donald Trump, this kind of challenge was especially difficult to counter. Over the years, he had developed a playbook for responding to critics. If someone attacked him harshly, he'd double down, often turning the attack into a spectacle and rallying his supporters around him. But when someone delivered a subtle, reasoned critiques, actually one involving his family, caught him off guard. Crockett hadn't given him the usual material to work with. There was no yelling, no inflammatory language, no obvious partisanship. In her tone, just a calm question that undermined a carefully managed image. Asterisk, it wasn't the first time Trump had been caught off balance by someone who refused to match his tone. During his presidency, he had faced critics who approached him not with fury, but with quiet, persistent questioning. Those critics often had a longer-lasting impact than those who shouted. Crockett's question about Melania fell squarely into that category. It wasn't just a swipe at a political opponent. It was a challenge to the narrative Trump had constructed around his marriage, his leadership, and his identity. Asterisk, that narrative had always included Melania as a figure of quiet support, graceful, reserved, and above the fray. But her long silence during Trump's legal struggles created a gap in the story. By drawing attention to that gap, Crockett didn't just critique Melania, she subtly pointed out a crack in the foundation of Trump's public image. And she did it without raising her voice. Asterisk, the reaction was telling. Trump lashed out in interviews, and behind the scenes, calling the comment disrespectful and accusing Crockett of crossing a line. But what he didn't do, what he couldn't do, was refute the observation itself. Because the truth was, Melania had indeed remained almost entirely out of view during the periods when Trump needed visible support the most. And once that was pointed out on a national stage, it became a conversation he could no longer control. Asterisk media outlets began to replay Crockett's comments, not because they were explosive, but because they raised a legitimate question. Why had Melania, who had once stood beside Trump through scandal after scandal, vanished from the spotlight when the legal stakes were at their highest? The commentary wasn't tabloid. Driving it was analytical, thoughtful, and surprisingly, bipartisan. Even commentators who typically defended Trump found themselves acknowledging the oddness of Melania's public silence. Asterisk, the contrast between Crockett's composed delivery and Trump's emotional response only magnified the issue. One side was calm, observant, and quietly provocative. The other was reactive, defensive, and visibly irritated. And for a growing number of Americans, that contrast told a story all its own. Asterisk, Trump's political strength has always relied on the appearance of control. He portrays himself as the alpha figure, always one step ahead, never rattled. But Crockett's question peeled back that illusion in a way few others had managed, without grandstanding or dramatics. She introduced doubt about the authenticity of the Trump family image, doubt about Melania's role in his political life, and doubt about how much of Trump's carefully curated narrative still held. Up under pressure, asterisk, in the days that followed, Crockett remained consistent. She refused to reframe or walk back her comments, emphasizing instead that public figures should expect public scrutiny, especially when their platform rests on themes like loyalty, traditional family, and moral leadership. Her confidence, paired with her restrained tone, gave her credibility and kept the conversation going long after. Trump's initial burst of anger had faded. Asterisk, it wasn't just what she said about Melania that made an impact, it was how she said it. And for Donald Trump, who had long used volume, bravado, and image management as tools of dominance, being challenged by quiet composure may have been the most disarming blow of all. When Jasmine Crockett raised the issue of Melania Trump's public absence, it sparked more than just political chatter. It reignited a national curiosity that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface for months. Her simple question during a congressional hearing didn't accuse, speculate, or insult. Instead, it held up a mirror to the public image Donald Trump had spent years building, and people began to look a little closer. Almost instantly, the media picked up the thread, revisiting Melania Trump's long periods of silence and re-examining her role, or lack thereof, in Donald Trump's political and legal storms. Asterisk, it wasn't just a matter of whether Melania appeared at events. What Crockett had subtly hinted at was something deeper, a pattern of detachment that clashed with the expectations set by Trump's own branding. He had for years touted traditional family values, loyalty, and strength as central to his persona. The presence of his wife and children at major political events was not incidental, it was essential to the optics. It reinforced the idea that Trump was not just a political leader, but the head of a strong, unified family. But when indictments started piling up and the walls seemed to close in, Melania's near-total silence stood out. Asterisk, after Crockett's comment went viral. Newsrooms began pulling footage and images from Trump's most high-profile legal appearances. What they found was consistent. Ivanka Trump had distanced herself publicly. Eric and Don Jr. remained close to the campaign, but Melania was almost entirely absent. She wasn't showing up at court. She wasn't offering statements. She wasn't even appearing in staged photos at Trump properties, where she had once been a staple. Asterisk, for someone like Donald Trump, who deeply values perception and media presence, the lack of visible support from his wife wasn't just a personal issue. It became a public liability. Journalists across networks began airing side-by-side comparisons of past first ladies during times of national scrutiny. Michelle Obama, for instance, had spoken candidly in defense of her husband during various controversies. Laura Bush had stood firmly beside George W. Bush through intense media storms. But in Trump's case, the comparison only emphasized the question, where was Melania? Asterisk, the public began to engage with the question on social platforms. The hashtag where is MELANIA trended once again, just as it had briefly during Trump's first impeachment, but this time it had teeth. It wasn't just about curiosity, it was about credibility. If Trump was still the figure of strength and dominance he claimed to be, why was the woman closest to him not stepping into the light to reinforce that image? Asterisk, and it wasn't just his critics who were asking. Even some conservative commentators raised the point delicately, noting that Melania's silence created a gap in Trump's public defense narrative. In Trump's world, perception is political capital. When that perception begins to crack, it becomes harder to maintain dominance over the narrative. Asterisk, Trump's team scrambled to contain the fallout. There were whispers of possible appearances or planned interviews involving Melania, but nothing materialized. In fact, the more the issue was discussed, the more apparent her absence became. And the more Trump tried to steer the conversation back toward policy, or what he saw as political witch hunts, the more the silence from his wife lingered in the air. Unanswered. Asterisk, the irony was striking. For a man who had built a brand around loyalty, strength, and family symbolism, the very image of his most intimate relationship was being chipped not by scandalous revelations, but by something far more powerful, a void. Crockett had pointed to that void, and the media, the public, and eventually even some within Trump's orbit, couldn't ignore it. Asterisk, the silence from Melania, once perhaps seen as dignified or private, began to be interpreted differently. In politics, especially at the presidential level, absence is rarely neutral. It sends a message, one that is often louder than words. And the longer that silence endured, the more it stood in contrast to the very values Trump claimed to champion. Loyalty, support, visibility. All three were suddenly questioned not by attacks, but by omission. Crockett's comment opened a door that had long been closed, and once it was opened, the scrutiny flooded in. Trump's frustration wasn't just with the comment itself, it was with the shift it caused. He was no longer just defending himself from prosecutors and political opponents. Now, whether he liked it or not, he was also defending a perception that his own household was as unified and supportive as he claimed. And in that moment, the silence from Melania began to speak volumes. The storm ignited by Jasmine Crockett's pointed observation did more than just ruffle feathers. It disrupted a long-standing illusion. For years, Donald Trump carefully constructed a narrative that revolved around control, dominance, and a loyal family front. But Crockett's calm and calculated words peeled back that surface. Exposing a vulnerability he had managed to keep at bay through force of personality and relentless media maneuvering. She didn't scream, didn't mock, and didn't exaggerate. She simply pointed to something millions had already noticed but few dared to say aloud. Melania Trump's conspicuous absence during her husband's most turbulent chapter. What followed wasn't just a flurry of media coverage, was a rare moment of reflection for a political machine that thrives on spectacle. Commentators and everyday citizens alike began asking not just where Melania was, but what her silence meant. Was it intentional? Was it a message? And if so, to whom? The speculation underscored how, in the high-stakes world of public life, absence is often interpreted as a statement in itself, especially for a figure like Donald Trump, whose very identity is built on visibility, image, and unity. The absence of his closest partner was a quiet but powerful contradiction. This isn't about personal attacks or prying into private lives. Rather, it's about the expectations placed on public figures, especially those who anchor their brand to traditional values and familial strength. When a politician campaigns on those ideals, their conduct and the conduct of those around them inevitably become part of the conversation. Crockett's remark didn't invent the question. It simply dared to bring it into the open. And once it was out there, no amount of spin or rage could shove it back into the shadows. For Trump. The hardest battles are often not fought in courtrooms or on debate stages, they are fought in the arena of public perception. The moment his image is shaken, the foundation of his influence begins to crack. Crockett didn't need to shout to make her point. Her restraint made the commentary even more devastating, revealing a chink in the armor that Trump had spent decades polishing. Melania's continued silence in the wake of this uproar became its own form of commentary. Whether intentional or not, her absence amplified everything Crockett had alluded to. And for Trump, a man who despises unanswered questions, when they center on him, this was a blow that landed deeper than any headline scandal. Not because it accused, but because it observed in the end. The controversy wasn't just about a wife not standing beside her husband, it was about the unraveling of a carefully crafted image. A single question triggered a national conversation. And in the world of politics, especially for someone who sees himself as invincible, that's more threatening than any courtroom verdict.